All right, so starting off for this lesson, we're learning how to use variables and functions. This is going to be maybe a little bit more complex as far than some of the other ones, but it can save you a lot of time when you're doing programs, especially when we get to programs when you're doing vehicles or something that's a lot longer. We'll have things that, you might have 100 lines of code, and if you have to change something, you have to go in and change a lot of those lines. Whereas if you use variables, you only have to change one thing. So what we're going to talk about today can save you a lot of time later on in this class. All right, so again, I have our assignment right here, number 6, testbed variables and functions. I have robot C pulled up. This has all my testbed stuff up here. So we're ready to go. So it says starting off, just copy and paste this in here. Okay. And before I run it, let's look and see what this is. So you'll see right here, it says int. Okay. Int, that right there, is what tells it that we are doing an integer. Sorry, not an integer. It tells it we're doing a variable. Excuse me. Our variable is going to be an integer. That's why we're using int. And so after the int, we name our variable. Now you can name it whatever you want. Okay. This one right here, it says motor count just because we're going to count how many times the motor goes. All right, so it says int, and then you give it a name, and then we need to give it a starting value. So we're saying that our starting value of this variable is going to be 0. Right? Notice that this is all before we get to our while loop. So then we have our while, and it says motor count, and that's just referencing the variable that we named, less than 3, meaning that as long as that variable is less than 3, run this program. All right, our program is pretty simple. It says start motor, write motor, and run it at 95 speed, and wait for 2 seconds. So meaning we're going to run our motor for 2 seconds, and it says stop and wait for 2 seconds. And by the way, hopefully I've mentioned this, but I want to keep emphasizing this. After we start a motor, we should always stop a motor, and you should always have wait times after a start and wait times after a stop. They don't have to be as long as this. But you should always have wait times after a start, and then there should always be a stop and a wait time after a start. All right, so there we go. So it's going to run that program, pretty basic. And then right here we see our our variable again. We say that our variable equals what the variable was plus 1. And all this is saying, okay, add 1 to what that variable was. Well, remember we started at 0. So once it gets here, it's going to add a 0 plus 1 and get to 1. And then it's going to say, okay, the motor count, well, 1 is less than 3, so it's going to run this again. And then every time it gets to the end, it's going to add 1 to that motor count until eventually my motor count is going to be a number that's not less than 3, and it's going to stop. All right. So hopefully you can see I have it zoomed in on this wheel. This is controlled by the motor. At least I hope that's the one that's controlled by the motor. All right. I want to hit robot, compile, download. Okay. And let's see. Before I run this, I'm going to come up here to robot and see if it'll actually show me my variable. See if I get global variables. Yeah, global variables. So I hit robot, debugger window, global variables, and now I actually see my motor count there. Right. So let's hit the start button. It spins just one time, spins again, spins again, and there we go. It spun 3 times, and then that value went to 3, which is not less than 3, so my program stopped. So it ran that program 3 times. Okay. Now, if you're having trouble seeing that motor count variable, don't worry. We're going to get to that in a second. I'll show you how to get that. But all right. So number 2, what happened when you ran the program just now? And then number 3, I want you to alter the program to make the motor run back and forth. So not just run one direction, run to the right stop, run to the left, stop. Do that 20 times, but only do it for 0.5 seconds each way. So half a second one direction, half a second the other direction. Do that 20 times, and then the program should stop. All right. So make sure you test, troubleshoot, get it to run correctly. Paste that program right here. And of course, make sure you're documenting with your pseudocode. Okay. Oh, and just a reminder, hopefully if you've gotten this far, you know that if robot C is not responding, then that means I need to take my orange cord, pull it out from my computer, and then magically robot C responds, plug my orange cable back in, and we should be good to go. In fact, I actually just started running the program automatically. All right, but I don't need to do this running system. Okay. All right, so moving on. All right, so here's how we can see that values. Okay, so this is probably the most complex part we're going to do. I'm going to try to walk you through this step by step, so pay very close attention. First thing we got to do right here, it says select view. That's up here. We're going to select view. We're going to come to preferences. We're going to come all the way down to detailed preferences. Okay. And then right here under menu label, we're going to change it from basic to super user and hit OK. Once we do that, now we can do this. Suddenly it lets us have a lot more options. So now if I hit view, well, now that list is suddenly a lot bigger. I hit view, I hit preferences, and now I can see global stack variable settings right here. Okay, and we want to force classic. Yours will be on standard, which is why a second ago, if you tried to get that variable on there, it probably didn't pop up. So we want the force classic. Okay, once you click force classic, that'll pop up and we'll hit OK. All right, now before I can go on to this next part, it says use a robot debugger mirror. The problem with that is if I click robot and debugger windows, it's grayed out. Okay, so I'm actually going to have to scroll down to the program. So I'm going to highlight this new program we have. Copy that. Come over here. Paste that in there. Okay. And then come up here to robot, compile and download. I'm not going to hit start. I just needed that in there before I could run to the next part. Okay, so there it is. So we're going to now come up here, and now I can do this step. It says robot debugger windows, and I want to make sure I select global variables and sensors. If those are already checked, great, but most likely they're not, or at least the global variables, it's probably not. So make sure you select those. Once you select it, then under global variables right here, you should see biggest. Now, if you don't see biggest right there, that's okay. As soon as you hit start right there, then biggest should pop up, okay? All right, so we have biggest right there. Now, biggest, where did that come from? Well, right here in our program, it says int biggest. Now, remember I said you can name these whatever you want. And so that's what they named it. And they named it that because we're actually are trying to figure out what's the biggest or largest value that we're going to get from our potentiometer. So it says, okay, right here, while 1 equals 1, meaning we're going to loop this forever, biggest equals 0, meaning they're setting their integer equal to 0. It says while sensor value bump switch equals 0, meaning while the bump switch is not being pressed, run this. If the sensor value potentiometer is greater than biggest, then biggest equals the sensor value. So meaning anytime the potentiometer is larger than the biggest value, set the biggest value to the potentiometer. That looks really strange, but this actually is going to hopefully make sense. So let's go ahead and start. And let's see how this works. Now, I'm going to try it with the bump switch. The bump switch I have has a short in it, so I'm not sure how well it's going to work, but I might have to switch mine to a limit switch. All right. bit. Okay, now the potentiometer is this thing right here that turns, just a small one. The super important thing about the potentiometer is that the potentiometer cannot spin forever. So I'm gonna click on sensors, okay? And I'll set my potentiometer to 0, and I feel my potentiometer stop moving when I set to 0, okay? Now coming over here to these, over here, it talks about moving the debugger windows. So if I see it, I can click on, and I can only see one at a time right now. But if I click on, say, global variables and drag it, I can move it wherever I want. And if I click on it, see, once I click on it, these little boxes pop up. And if I click on it and I move it to that bottom box, then it like docks it down there. And so now I can see, I'll lower that there. And so now I can see the biggest, and I can see my potentiometer value right here. So my potentiometer value is 0. Now, if I turn my potentiometer, my biggest value is not doing anything. Watch my potentiometer. It's getting close to my biggest value. As soon as my potentiometer hits that value, my biggest value starts going up. Now I'm going to turn my potentiometer the other direction. It's getting smaller. The biggest value stays the same. So that biggest integer is only recording the largest value that my potentiometer reaches. It's like recording the maximum. Okay, I'm going to turn my potentiometer down here like 600. Now, and I'm going to hit my bump switch. There we go. Now, I don't know if you noticed on here, when I hit my bump switch, that value went to 0 and then shot up to 621 because that's what my potentiometer was at. And now if I increase my potentiometer, that value goes up. If I decrease my potentiometer all the way down to 0, hit my bump switch, it shoots down to 0, and then my potentiometer keeps bouncing around a little bit. So there we go. So biggest right here is recording the largest value of my potentiometer, but then I reset it using my bump switch. All right. So that's what you did there. Number 5, you're just answering what did our program just do, okay? And then number 6 right here, I want you to modify this program. Instead of biggest, we're going to type, you're going to call it closest. And then we're using our ultrasonic distance sender, our sonar device. So that's this one right here. And remember, our sonar measures distance in inches. So for instance, if I find my sonar, there it is right now, it's measuring 55 inches because that's how far it is from there to the ceiling. If I move my hand in front of it though, now it's at 12, 10, 8, 7, okay? Moving it closer is measuring the distance in inches. So I want you to come up with a program where this variable called closest is measuring the smallest value that your sonar picks up, okay? So think about how you're going to have to change that program to make that happen. Also, instead of triggering it with the bump switch here, I want you to use the, right here, the limit switch. So the limit switch should be the thing that resets it, okay? Bold those so you can see those. All right. Make sure you put it using your pseudocode. So make sure, remember like things like this, that you're making notes, so double lines turn green and make notes onto what line each line of code is doing. All right, and then this last one. This last one is admittedly pretty weird, but fortunately there's not a whole lot you got to do about it, do with it. The first part that makes it weird is when I copy and paste this, if I copy and paste it like I normally do, like that, Control C, and I come over here, oops, I should hit X. Normally I would copy and paste like this. Robot, compile, download, and it's going to give me some errors. And here's why. Here's my program. Notice that task main is not the top. Everything else we've done, task main is always the first thing on the list. Whereas here, they're giving me this thing above task main, all right? So what I need to do is actually highlight all of this, task main, all of those curly brackets, and paste over all of it, okay? And now if I hit robot compile and download. It should work. All right, so let's explain what this is doing. When it says void right here, what we're doing is we're naming a function. Okay, so this right here is our function. And then task main says, while 1 equals 1, run this function. And that's really it. Okay, I know there's a lot of stuff going on here, but that's actually it. It says, while 1 equals 1, run this function. And then down here it says, well, what is this function? Well, this function is this program. Now, I know this is weird, but what we're really doing is embedding a program inside a program. Okay, that's helpful if you want the program maybe to repeat multiple times or be inside of itself. So again, that's a little complex, but that's what's going on here. You're embedding a program inside of another program. Let's see what this program does. It's actually a pretty simple one. I hit start. I'm going to zoom out the thing just a little bit, and hopefully, well, I should just slide things over. And you should be able to see. So there's my LED right there. When I hit my bump switch, I don't know if you can see it, but my LED is coming on. Now, again, I have a short in my bump switch, so it doesn't work super well. There we go, it's on. There we go, it's working better now. Okay, I'm gonna hit stop just so you can see it work better. If I come down here, and you shouldn't have to do this because hopefully your bump switch is working, but I'm gonna change this to limit switch, robot compile download program. Hit start, and then I'm running this with my limit switch, and it works much better. Like as soon as I touch it, that LED's on, like goes off. Okay, so yeah, the program itself actually runs really, really well, just so long as your switch or your sensor is working well. All right, so anyway, there's that program. Going back here, all you need to do is to say, all right, when you compile and run the program, what happened? That's it, and you're done. Any questions on those? Let me know.